All right. Hey, everybody. My name is Daniel Shirley. I am a lifelong student of classical education, and I wanted to go ahead and dive in to a series of video essays, at least one video essay, kind of surrounding some of the interesting dynamics of the current classical renewal movement and kind of what's going on in the broader world. Some nagging questions that I've had about the classical tradition for a long time, and kind of where I think that students and administrators, teachers, different kind of roles inside the classical education world, where they can act to kind of bring about the next wave of the restoration of tradition. So, with that being said, let's go ahead and dive right in. I already said my name's Daniel Shirley. I grew up in the Classical Conversations program, and so I was in that world for about 20-ish years, and still work with them in a administrative capacity. And I went to small liberal arts colleges, kind of moving through my undergraduate and graduate education. And now I spend most of my time teaching, and which is a great excuse to go about reading the things that I actually want to take the time and read. It's one of my favorite Latin proverbs is I think it's docendo discemus, something like as we teach, we learn. So this is something that's always rung true. All right, so the classical tradition is in a state of kind of it's both getting stale and it's also hitting a new arc, or at least it has the potential to hit a new arc here, I think, in the next 5 to 10 years, but it's going to have to do more than it's been doing over the last kind of 20 to 25 years as it's really kind of just started to get off the ground. And so there is a paper that I prepared for the Circe Institute a little while back that I think highlights a important moment that we are in the classical education world, especially in the, let's say, the pop classical education world, because there's kind of two or three big voices out there kind of defining everything about what classical is. And then there's all of the different indie groups, right? Let's say, that have their own definitions, but they're not popular. They're not out there. People don't refer to them when they think about classical education. So this paper originally had to do with the concept and the kind of, let's say, the nature of poetry and why we should engage with poetry, even if we're not looking to, let's say, become a writer, right? To create something that's going to be published or that you're going to be paid for or anything like this. Why should the average person engage with poetry? And why don't they? Because one of the stats that I'll get to a little bit later in this video indicates that for a while, the kind of mass appeal of poetry, poetry for the common person or poetry for the amateur, as opposed to the expert or the professional, was way down compared to what it had been in the past. And there's anecdotal evidence for this kind of thing. Like if you remember your parents might remember their parents reading them, a poem or muttering poems to themselves as they were going around the house, kind of doing different chores, this kind of thing. They didn't have to be complex poems. They didn't have to be theologically dense. They didn't have to be philosophical. They didn't even have to be the most beautiful, but they still had poems that were a part of their kind of everyday experience. There's a really great example of this in Wendell Berry's novel, Jayber Crow, where at the end of the novel, he starts kind of muttering these poems to himself about, I don't know, digging holes or casting a fishing line. And they're really simple, just kind of rhyming two-word lines. So, poetry and the nature of poetry, why should we engage with and read poetry and what happened? Why did poetry all of a sudden kind of stop being a part of normal life and seem to kind of ascend to the just a practice for the artistic elites, something like this? And so what does this have to do with classical education? I'll get to that as we move into it. And I think there's a pretty fun kind of popular example that we can point to right now to see how this is actually influencing the classical education space. So I begin the essay talking about the state of poetry in the postmodern world is already more vibrant than it is in the modern world. And when I say the modern world, I mean that kind of era of like the early 1900s. And in the postmodern world, which is maybe the world of our recent memory, we can say poetry is actually experiencing a kind of revival, a kind of resurgence right now amongst just kind of the popular crowd. So Pew Research did a, let's see, was it Pew or public, the survey of public participation in the arts recently revealed that only 7% of Americans had read a poem in the preceding year. So in 1992, let's say this is kind of like modernism's last heyday, right? 1992, we have the number of people that have read a poem in the last year is something like 7%. And then the trend persisted in decline until you can probably guess the year that things changed. It's when a lot of things changed, 2020. And then it started kind of ticking back up the number of people that had read a poem in the last year. And so, what does this mean? Right? What does this mean? Well, in the context of my essay, I was trying to get to the idea that we should all write poetry. So we can kind of leave that aside a little bit. But if we know that the number of people that have read a poem in the last year is 7%, the number of people that have written a poem is going to be minuscule. Because for everyone that reads a poem, the number of people that go and try to compose similar kinds of verse is going to be, I don't know, 1 in 10, maybe, if that. So not that many people are writing poetry. But it is hopeful now that more people are reading poetry. So then we have to grapple with, well, why did this happen? Why did poetry become so niche? If the 20th century produced some of like if you go to English class at college, you will kind of hear the names of these famous poets, right? Like what T.S. Eliot is a good picture of this kind of thing. Um, Famous poets of the 20th century, they're going to be in all the English classes doing the, having written kind of the classics that you read there. But they did not inspire people to love poetry. Um, so to understand how amateur poets kind of become estranged from the craft of poetry, we should first examine the evolution of the poetic discipline. So in the old world, right, let's say the old world, poetry functions as a device and a tool for memory, right? So we know that like the foundation and the root of, let's say, the Western literary tradition is, or just the literary tradition in general, is something like the Iliad and the Odyssey. You could throw the Bible in there as well as being kind of the first books that garnered like classic status, right? These books are the books that all other books refer to as they tell their own stories. And so as poetry kind of moves through the centuries, we have a bunch of domains of poetry that are beyond kind of my knowledge, but it becomes a consistent cultural production in every culture, right? And it's always for the sake of remembering the stories. So you take the language and you either compress it or you kind of expand it, depending on whether I guess you're Norse or Greek. You compress it or you expand it. And in doing so, you play with meaning, right? You play with the contraction of meaning, and you also phonetically, grammatically structure it in a way that it's interesting. It kind of sticks in your head. There's usually music associated with it. And this kind of, think about Shakespeare, right? So Shakespeare's stories are enacted on a stage, right? So there's a setting in which the poetry is engaged in for the sake of communal memory. But T.S. Eliot's not writing poems like that, right? T.S. Eliot is writing these ultra dense, super opaque poems like The Wasteland, which is it's a fascinating, it's a riddle of some kind, right? That's quite interesting. And maybe its point could be something like to illustrate that we've forgotten the old stories because you don't know all the references. And the list of references is iconically the length of the entire poem itself, right? So it's rooted in as much reference as it is its own language, right? Its own language is basically all reference. But this is a fundamentally different kind of exercise than something like Homer, right? So Homer was not going to be inaccessible to people in the culture in which it was written. They would know the different gods. They would know the different stories. They would know the backstories of the different characters, right? There's all sorts of stuff that's left out of the Iliad that people think is in the Iliad. But it's really just that kind of the legend, the legendarium that all the characters have that are participating in that central story. But this is not the way that we experience something like Eliot's poem. And many of the other kind of expert poets of the 20th century, they're all just opaque to us. We don't have the means to access the content of their poems. And you could kind of give them the benefit of the doubt and say, well, that's because we've forgotten the tradition. Or you could say, well, maybe they're doing it on purpose. Maybe they're trying to hide the meaning, right? Maybe they're trying to keep things veiled in a way that um, draws attention to something like a class divide. So why would I say that? Why would that be my hypothesis? I ran across an essay written in 1908, um, written by a guy named Thomas Holm. And I won't read the whole essay here, although I will link it so you can go read it yourselves. It's a good essay if you want to get an idea of kind of the arc that poetry kind of embarks on as we crest that kind of hill of the 19th century into the 20th. It's a bleak essay, right? So it's all about the comparison of the modern to the ancients. And in his comparison to the ancients, Holm is not very he's not kind. Okay, so in 1908, Holm delivers this essay. Describing the ancients' attitude toward poetry, Holmes says, they had the disease, the ancients, the passion for immortality. They wished to construct things which should be proud boasts that they, as men, were immortal. We see it in a thousand different forms, materially in the pyramids, spiritually in the dogmas of religion, and in the hypostasized ideas of Plato. Living in a dynamic world, they wish to create a static fixity where their souls might rest, right? So in this static fixity is what Holm is kind of, he's almost like psychologizing the anxious. He's saying this is their remedy to their fear of death, right? This is what they're doing to avoid the kind of confrontation, the inevitable confrontation with mortality. They make their arts immortal so that they can forget about their own mortality. And so this static fixity is rooted in a spirit of fear, essentially. And Holm regards this as a weakness and a refusal to confront the real truth of the human experience, which is the transience of it, the fact that it's just moving along constantly, and quickly. And so, what were the tools that the ancients employed kind of formally to emphasize this fixity, to kind of make their language more eternal than less eternal? The mechanics that they employed were these meters and rhythms and limits and forms that they compressed all of their poetic compositions into, right? So Holm goes on to explain now the whole trend of the modern spirit is away from that kind of thing. Philosophers no longer believe in the absolute truth. We no longer believe in perfection, either in verse or in thought, right? So there's this like formal component here, which we'll come back to when we return to the topic of classical education. So philosophers no longer believe in absolute truth. We no longer believe in perfection, either in verse or thought. We frankly acknowledge the relative. We shall no longer strive to attain the absolutely perfect form in poetry. Instead of these minute perfections in phrases and words, the tendency will be rather toward a production of a general effect. This, of course, takes away the predominance of meter and a regular number of syllables as the element of perfection in words. Right? So he's identifying himself. The element of perfection in words is the predominance of meter and the regular number of syllable. We are no longer concerned that stanzas should all be shaped and polished like gems, but rather that some vague mood shall be communicated. In all the arts, we seek for the maximum of individual and personal expression rather than for the attainment of any absolute beauty, right? So if you listen closely there, you can hear what is the modern art of poetry that most of us read and kind of attend to. What does it jettison? It jettisons regular meter and the attention to the syllabic construction of language, and it prioritizes, maximizes individual and personal expression, essentially synonymizing that with what poetry's goodness is that a good poem is the poem that's so unique and so individual that it almost can't be understood by anyone else, right? And in that kind of communication of a vague sentiment, there could be like this there's a word for like when you have the sense, like you can't see something, but you have a sense. Yeah, like this, the like what Lewis talks about in the beginning of um is it Problem of Pain? I think it's Problem of Pain. He talks about that sense of the numinous. These vague sentiments are really kind of an invocation of is there like a spirit, like a universal spirit behind this that I don't understand? There's probably a better way to say this, but that sense of the numinous is that vague sentiment that's communicated through the deep particularity and personal expression of the poem, right? And so this passage obviously says a handful of things that are objectionable to us as uh, keepers of the tradition. Number one, that there's no absolute truth. Now we can debate about like the nature of objective truth or something like that until we're blue in the face, but to say there is no truth is just not compatible. It's not compatible with what it is that we're instructing and teaching, and it's at the core of the practice of modern poetics. There is no perfection, right? There is no placing one thing over another thing and letting something be judged by an ideal. No, no, that's tyranny, right? That's tyranny. There is no absolute beauty. There is no ability to distinguish between two poems that are maximally individualistic. There is no standard by which to define and judge the nature of the beauty of a poem. And there's a scene that this should invoke, right, at the beginning of the Dead Poets Society.
Gentlemen, open your text, page 21 of the introduction. Mr. Perry, will you read the opening paragraph of the preface entitled Understanding Poetry?
Understanding Poetry by Dr. J. Evans Pritchard, Ph.D. To fully understand poetry, we must first be fluent with its meter, rhyme, and figures of speech. Then ask two questions. One, how artfully has the objective of the poem been rendered? And two, how important is that objective? Question 1 rates the poem's perfection. Question 2 rates its importance. And once these questions have been answered, determining the poem's greatness becomes a relatively simple matter. If the poem's score for perfection is plotted on the horizontal of a graph, and its importance is plotted on the vertical, then calculating the total area of the poem yields the measure of its greatness. A sonnet by Byron might score high on the vertical, but only average on the horizontal. A Shakespearean sonnet, on the other hand, would score high both horizontally and vertically, yielding a massive total area, thereby revealing the poem to be truly great. As you proceed through the poetry in this book, practice this rating method. As your ability to evaluate poems in this manner grows, so will your enjoyment and understanding of poetry.
This is kind of too far and the other, direction of that's the way that they judge the beauty of a poem, right? That's not the way you judge the beauty of a poem either. But we don't have to get caught in this either or dichotomy. It doesn't have to be chartable or no standard at all, right? There isn't a thing like that in the human experience where it's like either a chart or no standard. Everything exists somewhere in between on that gradient, right? And poetry is no exception. So when it comes to the nature of the amateur poet, which most of us are amateur poets, our students are certainly amateur poets, it doesn't surprise me that when I sit down to do a kind of opening for my class, that 75 to 80% of the students that are in that class, usually like the ones that are interested in writing poetry, are the artistically inclined already. So they play music, they draw, this kind of thing. They're used to kind of expressing themselves in non-standard ways. Um, but the majority of what I would say the non-artists, right, the normal students in my classes uh, have a distaste for poetry. They don't like poetry. So they rather than kind of being indifferent to it, they despise it, right? Why? And I think this has something to do with it. I think that the kind of core, the secret to why they hate it is because deep buried inside of it are these sentiments of no truth, no beauty, no goodness. The ancients, we totally reject them. We come from no tradition, but we're going to tell you what we think, right? The students hate it when they do this to each other. Like if they have that attitude and they come into class and they start talking to each other and debating, they find that irritating and it maddens them. So it's no wonder that these poems that have this same sentiment kind of like at their core are also making them irritated. And then poetry as the whole canopy takes the blame for just this small chapter in the history of poetry. And so, in order to encourage our students to love poetry again, we need to read the old poems. We need to read the old poems. Why should we encourage our students to practice the art of not just reading poetry, but writing poetry as well? So, this comes back to the classical education world. I think, and I'm continuing to be convinced of this truth that the form of something and the content of something have to match. If they don't match, then we're in this weird tension that's kind of like constantly listening to a high pitch hum, right? It's like slowly driving you crazy that the form of the thing and the content of the thing don't match. What are some really basic and good examples of this? If this water bottle was like just had no ability to contain liquid, the bottom of it was just gone, and I still tried to use it to drink water, then I would go mad, right? I'm pouring water into the bottle, I'm bringing it up to my lips, and there's nothing in the bottle again, right? The nature of poetry is like this, right? The nature of poetry is like this. Poetry, I think, is the mechanism, the primary mechanism that actually teaches us this. So if we think about the nature of classical education, most of us would be familiar with something like the trivium, talking about pop classical education topics. The trivium is the pop classical education. Right? It's like we practice the the seven liberal arts. Here are three, right? Grammar, dialectic, and rhetoric. And John Milton talks about this as well in his essay on education. He says that grammar, dialectic, and rhetoric are the first arts of the liberal arts that students learn. But then they move to, let's say, the arts of measurement, right? Which are mathematics. Um, what is it? Is it arithmetic, geometry, harmony, and astronomy, right? So all of these are kind of theoretical and then applied numbers in space, numbers in motion, numbers in space and motion. But how do you transition from the trivium into the quadrivium? And this, I think, is the crucial element of the study of poetics. Because without, and particularly the study of poetics that attend to syllable and meter, because if you don't have these kind of numerical overlays onto the language, then you're not practicing poetics as it is meant to be practiced for the amateur, right? The amateur is not supposed to attempt to just express their individuality through their writing of poetry. It's a waste of time. It's a waste of time. What you should be doing is taking your form and then taking a topic or maybe imitating a topic from another great writer and matching those things together and writing a poem that way. And what's happening kind of in that process, I think two things are happening. You are learning how form and content synthesize or disagree. So if I'm writing a poem about, let's just pick like a season, fall, and I choose to write the poem in trochaic tetrameter, right? Something like this. Then in that form, you can kind of hear a falling meter. And so you can match the nature of the words to the substance of the poem. So you have a harmony between the content and then the form, the grammar and the meaning, right? And these things help us as human beings because we all know this. We know that form and content should go together. There are so many places in our world where they don't. So by harmonizing them, we get a sense of how a form can agree with content and when it's mismatched. And we train that intuition. I like to use the example of those, what is it? The Whoop fitness trackers. I have a Garmin on at the moment, but these little devices are not terribly accurate. They do an okay job, but what they are is they're inaccurate the same way every time. And so regardless of what this says, you can start you could start training your intuition based on the nature of the watch or check your intuition. You're like, am I correct in my intuition here that this form doesn't match with this content? Am I correct that my sleep score doesn't actually reflect the way that I'm feeling right now? But I got 2 points worse than last night. So do I actually feel kind of, correspondingly worse? These ways that we can work with tools and forms to train our kind of natural sense of things, to train our human sense rather than becoming a slave to the meter, right? Allowing that to teach us and hone our intuition for when things are matching or when something's off. So the second thing that it does is it teaches you how to move into the quadrivium because you're taking the language arts and you're merging them with the mathematical arts, right? We're getting a sense that, oh, these two things have a lot to do with each other. These two things are connected and related deeply. And so, this all being said, don't be surprised if your students hate poetry, because I think a lot of these poets wrote their poems so that people would hate poetry. They prioritized expressing themselves in their individualism. This is also a reason that poetry is associated with kind of like high class or like all of the arts suffer from this in a certain sense, but it's also associated with like being a snob or being arrogant. And this is just a total paradigm flip from the way that poetry was used in the ancient world. This was something that, um, at the end of a day, like if you were out on your farm or something like this, and you were sitting down around a fire, like you would tell stories, and the stories would be in poetic sense and tradition. Your kids were going to bed, you'd tell them stories. And so in the modern world, I think that there's a turn right now that is that is definitely potent. And you can see it because one of the first epic poems that's been, many people have attempted something like an epic poem since Milton, right? But none of them have really stuck. I think Derek Walcott wrote a poem called Omeros that I've only read little bits of. It seems lovely in certain places, but also very individualized, let's say, not a large communal kind of epic experience, but something that is kind of more particular. And in this kind of lurch, there's a poet named Malcolm Guite who's writing a Arthuriad, which was actually a project that John Milton wanted to complete at some point. He chose not to do that because it was too crazy and decided to write Paradise Lost instead. But Malcolm Guite is taking up this tale of Arthur and is is retelling it in epic poetic form, which is an amazing thing to see, and it's doing very, very well. It's wildly successful. Um, Being out for a couple of months, you can look at it on Amazon. It's in all sorts of top book lists, and it's like, why is that hunger there? Why is that hunger there? I think that it's there because, well, one, there's all sorts of like the classical renewal has been around for 30-ish years now, and people are craving that kind of next step, right? And they can sense that in Malcolm's poetry, there's that bridge between the trivium and the quadrivium. And then also, I think that they're just hungry for tradition, right? They know the emptiness of the modern poets and they can feel the selfishness in their words. And so when you have a poet that's as genuine as Malcolm Guite, not even telling his own story, right? He's telling another story that's been told for thousands of years, 1,400 years, something like this. And as someone does that, you can get a sense, oh, like they care not just about themselves, right? They care about the tradition that they're participating in. They care about the story, they care about the characters, and they care about me as well. And this is something that you do not feel when you read the modern poet. So anyway, I hope that this is interesting. I look forward to continuing to make some videos like this. Thank you all for your time.